ever agree to something, shake on it like it's a done deal, and then bam, the other person's off. Just kidding.
Yeah, not cool.
It's like the worst. But you know what's even more frustrating? When a promise feels like a sure thing, but legally, it's totally meaningless.
Right, like it might as well have been written on, I don't know, a napkin.
Exactly. And that's where contract law comes in, this whole system of figuring out when a promise actually carries weight.
And believe it or not, it's way more interesting than it sounds.
Today, we're diving into the core of what makes a contract tick, when it's rock solid, and when it's about as flimsy as a house of cards.
We're talking about consideration.
Okay, consideration. So that's the magic word. What's it actually mean, though?
Yeah, basically, it's the heart of any legally binding agreement.
So it's not just about, like, keeping your word. There has to be something more, right?
It's about an exchange, something of value that both sides bring to the table. Think of it like a trade, a two-way street.
Okay, so a trade, what does that look like in, say, a really simple contract?
Buying a cup of coffee. You promise to pay the price. The cafe promises to give you that latte. Boom, consideration is straightforward exchange.
Right, makes sense. But it gets trickier with things like, I don't know, promising a favor. Like, if I say I'll walk your dog and then bail, you can't exactly sue me.
Exactly. Walking my dog, while a lovely gesture, doesn't have the same legal weight as, say, paying for a car.
So how do courts tell the difference between a casual promise and one that's legally binding, one that could actually hold up in court?
That's where things get a bit more nuanced. It comes down to whether something of value was truly bargained for by both parties.
Bargained for, so it's like a mutual understanding that each side is getting something they've agreed on.
Right. And this doesn't always have to be money or physical stuff either. Giving up a legal right, like agreeing not to sue, can also count as consideration.
Interesting. So there are all these different forms it can take. But then I was reading about these exceptions, like promissory estoppel and the material benefit rule. It's like the law has these loopholes.
You're right. There are situations where a promise, even without that classic exchange of value, can still hold up in court.
Okay, those exceptions, they sound like a whole other can of worms.
Oh, absolutely. And to really understand them, we've got to dive into some pretty fascinating court cases.
All right, hit me with your best shot. What kind of cases are we talking about? So we were talking about these times when a promise feels like a done deal, but legally speaking, it's missing that key ingredient, that consideration. What's a case that really throws a wrench in the works?
Well, let's talk about Kirksey v. Kirksey, 1845, so way back.
Okay, 1845, set the scene for me.
So we've got Antiloco Kirksey, a widow, has kids, and she gets this letter from her brother-in-law, Isaac.
Okay.
And he's like, hey, come live on my land. You know, tempting offer back then.
Yeah, I mean, especially back then, makes sense. So family looking out for family, what's the problem?
Well, so she takes him up on the offer.
Yeah.
Antiloco packs up, moves her whole life. 60 miles, not a short trip.
Wow, 60 miles, that's a journey.
It's a trek, right?
Yeah.
And builds a life there, relies on this promise, and then a few years later, she gets evicted.
Yeah.
By the brother-in-law.
No kidding. After she moves her entire life? That's harsh. What'd the court say about that?
And this is where it gets really interesting. The court actually sided with the brother-in-law.
What?
Yeah. They basically said, yeah, she moved, but what did he get out of it? You know, no tangible benefit, no
Hold on, no tangible benefit. She moves her whole family out there. She's probably helping out, maybe taking care of his kids too. I don't know. Like, that seems like a benefit to me. What were they thinking?
Well, and that's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
This case, it really shows you how back then they had this much stricter view of what consideration actually meant. They were looking for a much clearer quid pro quo. Like, you give me this, I give you that, a direct exchange. And yeah, there are theories out there about, you know, maybe the brother-in-law needed someone on the property for legal reasons, who knows.
Yeah.
But the court didn't buy it.
So, tough break for Antiloco. A promise, even a family promise, didn't equal a contract in this case. They were really looking for that price tag on everything. But then how does that work with cases like, I think it was Hamer v. Sidway? That one always stuck with me because it was all about a nephew giving up some, let's say, less than legal habits.
Hamer v. Sidway, a classic. It really shows how even giving something up can be considered valuable in the eyes of the law. It goes back to that bargain.
Right, like it has to be something that was agreed on. So in that case, the uncle promises his nephew this big chunk of change if he stays away from drinking, smoking, gambling, the whole 9 yards, until he turns 21. And the court was like, yep, that's a contract.
They did. Because the nephew's actions Giving up those things, that's what the uncle asked for in exchange for the money.
Mm.
It was a true bargain, a deal they struck.
Okay, so it's not just about someone like randomly doing a good deed or giving something up. It has to be part of this agreement, right?
Right.
Like if I say, hey, if you learn to juggle by next Friday, I'll buy you a plane ticket. That's not a contract, even if you're like practicing day and night.
Even if you're a professional juggler by then, yeah. Because the juggling, impressive as it might be, is not what we were bargaining for. More of a random condition,
Hmm.
not the heart of the agreement.
Okay, so we've got this whole bargain for exchange thing down. But what about those cases where the deal itself seems kind of off? Like, what about Batsakis v. Damatsis? That one seems to throw fairness out the window.
Batsakis. Now we're talking.
Mhm.
This one always makes people scratch their heads because it shows how a contract can seem completely lopsided but still be totally valid.
Right, right. And it all goes back to that adequacy doctrine, like the court isn't going to get into judging whether a deal was fair or not.
Exactly. As long as there's consideration there, they generally let the chips fall where they may.
But Batsakis pushes it to the limit. We're talking about a loan in Greece, World War II, 500,000 drachmas.
Desperate times.
Right, which at the time was like, what, 25 bucks in US dollars because of inflation in the war?
Yeah, the value is just gone.
And the lender is promised this huge return, 2,000 US dollars. It's like they were taking advantage of the whole situation.
It definitely seems that way looking back. And you're right. The deal looks totally one-sided in hindsight. But here's the thing, right? At the time they made the deal, both sides, they got what they initially agreed on. She needed those drachmas desperately to help her family, and he was taking a chance, a big one, on getting a return on his investment during a war.
So it was a gamble for both of them, but because they agreed to the terms, even if the value changed later on, the court's like, not our problem.
It's like you shook on it, you signed on the dotted line, it's a contract.
Yeah.
Tough, but it highlights how much emphasis they put on that initial agreement.
So we've seen how courts really try to find that initial agreement, that exchange of value, even in situations that might seem kind of shady after the fact. But what about those cases where it's like someone's whole life changes because of a promise? Someone relies on a promise so strongly that it completely changes their plans.
That's where promissory estoppel comes in.
Okay, promissory estoppel, we've mentioned it a few times. Break it down for me. What's the deal with that?
It's basically the legal system saying, hey, sometimes relying on a promise can be just as important as a formal bargain.
Okay.
It's all about fairness, about making sure someone isn't left high and dry because they trusted a promise that ended up hurting them.
Makes sense.
And the case that really exemplifies this is Ricketts v. Scawthorne.
All right, Ricketts v. Scawthorne, hit me with it. What's the story?
So we have a grandfather, John Ricketts, and he loves his granddaughter, Katie, wants to take care of her, promises her a good chunk of money so that she wouldn't have to work anymore. He wants her to be comfortable,
It's pretty generous. So what's the catch? There's always a catch.
Well, Katie, she trusts her grandfather, right?
Oh.
So she quits her job, relies on that promise, makes life decisions thinking that money's coming. And then, unfortunately, the grandfather passes away.
Oh, man, that's rough. So what happens to Katie? Does she get the money?
This is going to surprise you. The court initially said no.
No, are you kidding?
No contract, no bargain for exchange. It seemed like her reliance on her grandfather's promise, it wasn't going to hold up.
Wow, that seems kind of cold. Like she quit her job, changed her life, all based on his word.
All right, it's a real heartbreaker.
Yeah.
But luckily, the court, they came around. They ruled in Katie's favor. But, and here's the kicker, they did it based on promissory estoppel, not on traditional consideration.
So even though there wasn't a contract in the usual sense, they recognized that the promise was a big deal, that Katie really relied on it.
Yes, and more importantly, that breaking that promise after she had relied on it so heavily would have been deeply unfair.
Okay, I get it. But then how does that work with the case we talked about before, Hayes v. Plantation Steel? The one with the employee and the pension. Because in both cases, there's reliance on a promise, but the outcomes are different. What's the difference?
You're right, it can seem confusing.
Yeah.
Hazy Plantation Steel always trips people up. But here's the key difference, the timing.
The timing.
In Hayes, the employee, he had already decided to retire before the pension was even mentioned.
Oh, I see.
So his decision to retire, it wasn't because of the promise. It was already in motion.
So even though he might have been counting on that money later, it didn't matter because the promise wasn't the reason he retired in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The court, they needed to see that direct link between the promise and the action taken. Katie quitting her job, that was because of her grandfather's promise. The retirement in Hayes, that was independent of the promise. Small difference, but super important legally.
Wow. So it's not enough to just rely on a promise. It has to be the thing that causes you to do something, to take an action. And even then, it sounds like the court has some leeway to decide whether breaking the promise is, like, truly unjust, right?
Absolutely. They're looking at the whole picture, the context, who these people are to each other. Was there a real harm done? It's about finding that balance, respecting the spirit of an agreement while making sure no one's getting tricked or taken advantage of.
This has been a wild ride. We've covered so much ground, from the very basics of contracts, this idea of consideration, to cases that really make you think about what makes a promise legally solid, and even these exceptions where reliance on a promise is enough.
It's really just the tip of the iceberg. Contract law, it's a whole world unto itself.
But at least now we have a better sense of how it all works. When a promise actually has weight, legally speaking, it's like having a secret decoder ring for all those times someone says, I promise. But even beyond the law, it makes you think about the weight of promises in general. So next time you make a promise, or someone makes one to you, think about what it really means, both legally and personally. That's it for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.